Well, it's a great pleasure to be invited to address this distinguished group. I was tempted to produce a PowerPoint. I was not told what to say, so I've more or less said everything, and I shall cut lots of bits out which Professor Booth and Professor Dumont and Professor Castellani have already said. In essence, my message is rather a general, overarching one. It is to say that the problems that we faced in terms of demographic challenges in Europe and elsewhere primarily arise out of the demographic transition, the mismatches in the demographic transition which have taken place, and the interaction of demographic transition with the democratic transition which gives people the vote. If people didn't have the vote, a lot of this change wouldn't matter, but they do, and it does. The demographic transition, if I may very briefly recap, is that once and for all a change in human population processes from traditional millennia-old high birth and high death rates over the last 200 years into low birth and low death rates. Totally unprecedented in human history, with consequences which are yet completely to unfold. That I suppose sums up the motto of what I want to say, and more broadly, until the demographic transition has come to an end, if we know what that end is, in all countries, then these tensions, international tensions, tensions of immigration, tensions of population aging will continue. And when the demographic transition is complete, then things will be easier, but it'll be probably beyond the lifetime of most of us in this room, I'm sorry to say. Demographic change does require these political responses. If transition is too slow, if population keeps on growing once the death rate's gone down, then you have excessive population growth. Not a European problem, but certainly a problem for much of the rest of the world. We have a problem of transition undershoots, as Professor Dumont emphasized with particular eloquence, of very low birth rates in some areas and consequent rapid population aging and population decline, provoking a political response in the form of population policies, almost all of which are completely ineffectual because they misunderstand the causes of low fertility. Some of these pressures have in the past, population pressures, provoked really quite revolutionary change. Population density, allied with other issues, is thought to have helped to provoke the French Revolution. Certainly the youth bulges helped to provoke the Arab Spring, exacerbated by climate change, exacerbated by corruption and gross inequality. There is just two examples, one old and one new, of the way in which demographic transition can start to have a rather important effect. The kinds of issues which we have to face from the unbalanced demographic transition are changes in the international order, which speakers have alluded to already, population aging, which has been discussed, and unbalanced international migration, the way in which rich countries have more or less completed the demographic transition, have low birth rates, low levels of population growth, older populations, neighboring countries in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, have not completed it. They have high levels of population growth, high levels of poverty, high propensity to migrate, with consequences that we all know about. And these generate different numbers, differential growth in different people, and particularly when it's allied to voting power, then these differences in numbers matter very much indeed. Population aging I will not dwell on because Professor Booth especially and also Professor Castellani have dealt with this most adequately. But that is a consequence of the demographic transition not being completed. You might have noticed that Professor Booth's graphs become somewhat less vicious and depressing after about 2050. That's because the demographic transition in rich countries is more or less coming to an end and resolving itself into a new stable population age structure, which will be rather easier to cope with, although at a much higher level of elderliness than we currently experience in the West. Here is the mismatch of international growth, which Professor Dumont spoke of. I would say more to do with the rapid population growth in big countries rather than the failure of population growth in Europe. But I would like to say that those big countries, China, India, especially whose growth is indicated here, are going to find themselves in trouble. It will not be a question, I think, of China or India ruling the world without really serious, quite serious problems of the kind I'll deal with if anyone is interested in talking about them later on. The blue line, by the way, is tropical Africa. What we're going to do when there are 3 billion people in tropical Africa, as almost certainly there will be, frankly, I don't know. This is a similar situation within Europe. These are Eurostat projections which don't take into account the enormous influx of migration over the last couple of years. They don't take into account, they couldn't take into account the possibility of Brexit. I must point out to Professor Dumont that they do show the UK slightly in the lead over France by mid-century. They also show Germany declining quite substantially, but that, of course, is before Mrs. Merkel's invitation to quite a lot of the Middle East to come to Europe, and particularly to come to Germany, which may bend that graph upwards instead of downwards. Population projections are often wrong. Nonetheless, a big change in the international order forecast there. One of the big consequences of these mismatched demographic transitions are of course, population migration from poor countries to rich ones. Poor countries are growing fast and rich ones not growing so fast. Here's the US, where the Bureau of the Census formally projects the white non-Hispanic population to become the minority, the numerical minority, by about 2045. Not that long in the future, almost inevitable, because the number of babies of white non-Hispanic parents are already a minority in the United States, and you can see the Hispanic population growing very rapidly. That may have really quite interesting population demographic and democratic consequences. And the same sort of thing is happening in many European countries. This is a projection of the ethnic populations in the UK. The declining line going downwards is the white British population. The lines at the bottom are the non-British white population in the hatched line, and the solid line is the coloured non-white ethnic minority population, and the British population scheduled to become a minority by about 2060 under the assumptions of that projection. And of course, projections utterly depend upon their assumptions. Those assumptions actually are rather conservative now, because immigration is much higher than it was. Immigration is now running at over 300,000 net increase in the population every year. That is more than what was assumed in that projection. So very big changes going on there. With, of course, the question, how much does it matter? Do the people, does the Hispanic population in the US, do the non-white populations in the UK want different things from the hitherto majority population? To some extent they don't, particularly if they're poor. They want welfare, they want healthcare, they want a growing economy, like the rest of us. But they also have special interests. The Hispanic population has a special interest in migration, in promoting the migration of its friends and relatives from Mexico and elsewhere to go to the US. The Muslim population in the UK, although sharing many of the aims and ambitions of the rest of the population, has a particular interest in religion. Many favour the introduction of Sharia law. Many have a strongly conservative view about marriage, the role of women, and all the rest, which takes it into a collision course with traditional, or rather modern anyway, British attitudes. And as a consequence of these changes, the majority strikes back. And we have seen some very interesting political changes take place with the rise of political parties keen on reducing migration. UKIP in the UK, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, the Front National in France, and many other parties in practically every other European country, even those which don't have very much migration in Eastern Europe. And their rise, I think, has been particularly provoked by the indifference of the elite for a very long time, for almost as long as opinion polls have been made on these things, the broad mass of the population has been suspicious of high levels of migration and has wanted to see it reduced, even in the United States, not just in Europe. Elite opinion, for a whole variety of reasons, tends to be different and tends to favor migration, both for ideological reasons and also for economic reasons, although I think that the economic analysis is for the most part misguided, and immigration is far from being the economic benefit which is universally assumed to be. Anyway, the consequence has been really quite a lot of upset in electoral change, in the outcome of elections. We've seen that in many countries, and most dramatically we've seen it in Brexit. Opinion polls seem to make it clear that one of the most powerful reasons for the Brexit vote winning, contrary to most people's expectation, was a strong desire to see at last a substantial reduction in migration. Now, a Brexit vote does not of itself automatically limit migration. First of all, it only applies, of course, or only has an immediate obvious effect upon EU migration. Also, it does depend on what the government actually does with this Brexit vote, how much it's prepared to try to reduce migration from the European Union. At the present time, it seems that it has a strong inclination to do that, and there's a possibility of reducing migration from the EU by of the order of 100,000 a year. Only 20% of migrants from the EU would enter the UK were they subject to the same criteria as have applied to non-EU migrants. So, finally, we have, to recap, this demographic change, these demographic problems which provoke political problems, which provoke political responses, are to do with, in my opinion, the demographic transition, mismatches in the demographic transition between different populations, and the interaction of that with democratic politics, which greatly magnify the importance of population differences because people who live in those populations can vote. On that point, I'll stop. Thank you.